She warned me with her smile, but her eyes dared me to cross the line. I told myself I'd keep my distance, until her silence started to feel like gravity pulling me closer. I first saw her on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that feels too still for anything significant to happen. Yet that's when life likes to surprise you. She was standing near the window of the local art studio, sunlight pouring through the glass and tracing gold outlines along her hair. She wasn't trying to be noticed, and maybe that's what made it impossible not to. There was something composed about her. The kind of calm that comes from knowing who you are, and not needing to prove it to anyone. She looked like someone who had already lived through her storms and learned how to walk through them with grace. When our eyes met for the first time, she offered a polite smile, the kind people give when they're being kind, not curious. But her eyes, they said something else entirely. It wasn't seduction. It wasn't even interest. It was awareness. As if she noticed the way I looked at her, curious, intrigued, and wanted to see what I would do next. Her smile said don't, but her eyes whispered, try me. I told myself it was nothing. Just the usual trick of the mind when you meet someone who stirs something unfamiliar. But as the afternoon went on, I found my attention pulled toward her without meaning to. I noticed how she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she focused on her painting, how she laughed softly when someone made a small joke nearby, a sound more delicate than cheerful, like it came from a place she didn't visit often anymore. When I passed behind her to grab another brush, the faint scent of her perfume brushed the air between us, a mix of jasmine and something woody, something grounded. It wasn't loud, but it lingered, like memory. I tried to focus on my work, but every small movement of hers, every shift of posture drew me back. Later, when the class ended, she was the last to leave. As she cleaned her brushes, she looked up and met my gaze again. "You're new here," she said, her tone light, conversational. "Yeah," I replied. "Trying something different." Her lips curved in a knowing half-smile. "Different can be good," she said quietly, then slipped her things into her bag and walked out before I could think of a reply. For a while, I just stood there, watching the space she'd left behind, an empty chair, a faint scent, and a strange sense that something small but important had just begun. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know her story. But I knew her smile wasn't meant to stop me. It was meant to test if I'd have the courage to stay curious. And from that moment I did. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. But sometimes, life has a quiet way of arranging what the heart isn't ready to admit at once. A few days later, I walked into the same cafe where I usually stopped after class, and there she was, sitting by the window with a book in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. I almost turned around, unsure if approaching her would seem intentional. But she looked up before I could decide, and when our eyes met, she smiled, softer this time, less of a warning, more of a welcome. She gestured to the empty seat across from her. "You can sit, if you don't mind a little silence," she said. That line lingered with me, a little silence. It told me everything about her. She didn't fill the air with meaningless talk. She valued quiet, but she didn't fear it. I sat across from her, and for a few minutes, we said almost nothing. The world outside moved, cars, voices, the hum of life, but between us, there was stillness. It wasn't awkward, it was grounding. I noticed how she stirred her coffee slowly, how her fingers brushed the rim of the cup before lifting it. Her movements were deliberate, calm, like everything she did had weight. Eventually, she broke the silence. "You seemed focused at the studio," she said. "Are you an artist?" I laughed lightly. "Barely. I'm more curious than talented." Her smile deepened. "Curiosity is a good start. Most people stop being curious long before they stop being young." That line stayed with me, the way she said it, almost wistfully, as if it wasn't advice for me but a quiet confession about herself. I didn't push her to explain. Instead, I asked about her work, and she told me she used to teach art before she decided to take time for herself. There was something in her voice, a hint of fatigue that didn't come from age, but from giving too much of herself to the world. Our conversation stretched naturally after that. Time slipped by unnoticed. We spoke about travel, music, the strange peace of being alone. She listened more than she talked, but when she did speak, it felt like every word mattered. When we finally stood to leave, our hands brushed as we both reached for our coats. It was the smallest touch, skin meeting skin for barely a second, but it froze me in place. The warmth of her hand lingered, soft but startlingly real. She didn't acknowledge it directly. She just looked at me with that same half-smile, the one that always meant more than it showed. "See you in class?" she said, turning toward the door. And as she walked away, I realized I'd stopped trying to pretend it was coincidence. Something had started between us, quiet, careful, but alive. After that afternoon, something subtle shifted between us. The space we once filled with polite conversation began to hum with quiet awareness, the kind that hides in pauses, in glances held a little too long, in breaths drawn just a little slower when the other is near. At the studio, she greeted me with that same careful smile, but her eyes seemed to soften when they found mine. It wasn't flirtation, it was familiarity, laced with hesitation. She knew what was happening, maybe even before I did. We began talking more during breaks, nothing that crossed any line, but enough to feel the pull tighten. She asked about my life, my plans, my family. When she listened, she gave me her full attention. It was disarming, like being seen without having to prove yourself first. One evening, rain tapped gently against the studio windows as the class thinned out. Most people had already left, leaving behind the scent of paint and the low hum of quiet music. She was wiping her brushes, and I was still lingering at my canvas, pretending to work while stealing glances in her direction. She noticed, of course. "You're still here," she said softly, her voice warm but cautious. I shrugged, smiling. "Guess I lost track of time. Or maybe you just like the quiet," she teased. She wasn't wrong. The quiet between us had become its own kind of language, one that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. When she reached for a jar on the top shelf, I stepped forward instinctively. "Here, I got it," I said, taking it down for her. My fingers brushed hers as I handed it over, light, accidental, but electric in its simplicity. She froze for a heartbeat. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, and in that fraction of a second, the air grew heavy. I saw the conflict in her, the part of her that wanted to step closer, and the part that reminded her she shouldn't. "Thank you," she said finally, pulling her hand back. Her tone was polite again, but her composure had cracked ever so slightly. "I like being around you," I admitted before I could stop myself. The words slipped out, unplanned and too honest. Her gaze softened, but there was sadness there, too. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. "Why not?" "Because they make it harder to stay sensible." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was alive, trembling between what was right and what was real. When we finally stepped outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the pavement shining beneath the streetlights. She walked beside me, close enough that our shoulders almost brushed, but not quite. That night, I realized something important. The danger wasn't in what we said or did. It was in everything we didn't. The restraint itself had become its own kind of intimacy, and I wasn't sure either of us knew how much longer we could hold it. It happened on a Friday evening, the kind of night that starts ordinary but ends up changing something quietly, without permission. The class had wrapped up, and most people had already gone. She stayed behind, tidying up her brushes, humming faintly to herself. I lingered too, under the excuse of cleaning my workspace, though I knew I wasn't fooling either of us anymore. Outside, rain had begun again, soft, steady, rhythmic. The sound filled the studio like background music, wrapping the moment in something both intimate and inevitable. She glanced at me. "You don't mind the rain, do you?" "Not if I've got good company," I replied before thinking. Her laugh was quiet, not mocking, but disbelieving. "You shouldn't say things like that." "I know," I said, meeting her eyes. "But I mean them." For a moment, neither of us looked away. The air between us seemed to thicken, the kind of silence that makes every breath count. Then she turned slightly, leaning against the counter, her hands gripping the edge like she needed something steady to hold. "You're making this difficult," she murmured. I took a step closer, careful, measured. "What am I making difficult?" "This," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This balance. This pretending that what's happening isn't happening." Her honesty caught me off guard. I didn't expect her to name it, to admit what I'd only been brave enough to feel. "I didn't mean to make things harder," I said softly. "I just like being around you. I can't seem to help it." She looked down, smiling sadly. "You make it sound so simple." "Maybe it is. It's not," she said, shaking her head. "You're younger. You don't understand what comes with this kind of thing. The looks. The questions. The guilt." Her words were calm, but her fingers trembled as she brushed a strand of hair from her face. I could feel the weight behind every sentence, the walls she had built, the fears she lived with. I took another small step closer, stopping just short of touching her. "I don't care what people think," I said. "I only care about what's real between us." She lifted her gaze slowly, and when our eyes met, it felt like the whole room tilted. There was longing there, and restraint, and something deeper neither of us dared to name. Then she whispered, "You make it hard to remember where my lines are." I didn't speak right away. My throat was tight, my heart beat louder than the rain outside. Finally, I said quietly, "Then maybe those lines aren't meant to stay forever." Her breath caught, just once. She looked away, blinking fast, her voice soft but unsteady. "You should go before I forget how to be careful." So I left. But as I stepped out into the rain, I realized she hadn't told me to stop, only to go. And somehow, that difference meant everything. The next week felt different, quieter, heavier, like something had been left unsaid between us that neither of us knew how to touch. At the studio, she kept her distance. Her smiles were brief, polite again. Her eyes, the same ones that once lingered on mine with unspoken warmth, now darted away the moment they met. She laughed with others, talked about mundane things, and moved around the room with practiced ease, as though nothing had ever shifted between us. But I could feel it. The space she was creating wasn't for comfort. It was for protection. I tried to tell myself it was fine. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd read too much into every shared silence, every glance. But that night by the rain, that trembling honesty, it hadn't been one-sided. I knew it. And I think she knew that I knew. So I gave her space. I arrived late, left early, spoke less. But distance didn't make it easier, it only made me more aware of her. I noticed when she wore her hair differently, when she avoided the seat near mine, when her laughter felt forced. I missed her voice even when she was only a few feet away. One evening, I stayed after everyone had left, hoping she wouldn't. But she did. She paused near the door, her hand on the knob, and looked back at me, that same look she'd given before the silence between us began. "You're still here," she said, her tone neutral. "Just finishing up," I answered, pretending to focus on cleaning my brushes. She hesitated, as if debating whether to say what she was thinking. "It's better this way," she finally said. I looked up. "Better for who?" "For both of us," she replied. "You're too kind, too open. I don't want to be the reason you complicate your life." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it hurt. "You think this is just complicated? It's not. It's real. I can't ignore it just because it doesn't fit what's expected." Her shoulders sank. "You make it sound easy." "It's not easy," I said quietly. "But walking away doesn't make it disappear either." For a long time, she said nothing. The studio was silent except for the soft hum of rain starting again outside. Then she gave a small nod, her voice barely audible. "You'll understand one day," she said before turning to leave. That night I couldn't sleep. I replayed every word, every look. And somewhere between those memories, realization settled in. I wasn't chasing infatuation. I wasn't drawn by mystery or charm. I missed her steadiness, her honesty, the quiet strength behind her walls. I didn't want her to change. I just wanted her to let me in. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe love wasn't about rushing towards someone. Maybe it was about standing still long enough for them to trust that you'll stay. It was another evening softened by rain, the kind that makes the city glow in reflections, quiet and forgiving. I hadn't expected to see her, but fate rarely asks permission. The art studio was closed for the weekend, and I was walking home when I spotted her across the street, standing beneath the awning of a small bookstore. She looked lost in thought, one hand clutching her umbrella, the other brushing damp hair from her face. I hesitated, then crossed over. "You're out in this weather again?" I said gently. She smiled faintly. "Seems the rain keeps following us." There was a pause, brief but deep. I could feel all the things we hadn't said hovering between us, waiting for someone to give them shape. She didn't walk away this time. Instead, she nodded toward the cafe beside the bookstore. "We could wait it out inside," she said quietly. Inside, the cafe was nearly empty. Candlelight flickered against rain-streaked windows, and soft jazz played low in the background. We sat near the corner, our coats draped over the chairs, steam rising from our cups. For a while, we just talked, not about us, but about everything else. Books. Art. The comfort of rain. Yet beneath the small talk, there was a pulse, a steady rhythm of something neither of us could deny. She looked at me across the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "You're quiet tonight," she said. "I'm just trying not to say too much," I replied. Her brows lifted slightly. "Afraid you might?" "Afraid I already have." That earned a soft laugh, but there was tension in her smile. "You make it hard to stay sensible," she murmured, almost to herself. I leaned forward, my voice low. "Then stop trying to be." Her eyes met mine, steady, searching. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, she said quietly, "You'll regret this one day. When the newness fades, when it gets complicated." I shook my head. "I've thought about that. But I'd rather regret the fall than the hesitation." Her breath caught, her composure faltering just slightly. She looked down, her hands tightening around the cup. When she finally looked up again, her eyes were glassy with something unspoken. I reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she didn't. My hand brushed against hers, warm and trembling. She whispered, "You should stop." "I will," I said softly. "The moment you tell me to." Her fingers lingered on mine, hesitant, trembling, and then, instead of pulling away, she turned her hand over, letting her palm meet mine fully. The cafe around us faded. The rain became background music. All that remained was the weight of that small, trembling connection, not a confession, not yet love, but the quiet surrender of two people finally done pretending. She exhaled shakily, whispering, "You really don't listen, do you?" "Only when I shouldn't," I murmured. And in that moment, the war between caution and desire found its truce, not in words, but in the stillness of her hand resting against mine. Some endings don't arrive with fireworks. They come softly, like the last note of a song that lingers long after the music stops. What happened after that night in the cafe wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and real, the kind of change that begins not in grand gestures, but in the way two people start showing up for each other without needing reasons anymore. We didn't label what was between us. We didn't rush to define it or defend it. Instead, we let it unfold in its own rhythm, slow, cautious, and honest. She still smiled that guarded smile sometimes, the one that said don't get too close, but her eyes had softened. They no longer challenged me to try, they asked me to stay. Days turned into weeks, and our moments became smaller, simpler. Sharing coffee after class. Walking home together under a shared umbrella. Sitting side by side in comfortable silence, the kind that only happens when two people have already said everything that matters without needing words. There were still moments of hesitation. She'd pull back now and then, reminding herself of the reasons she once built walls. But each time, I stayed patient. I didn't push, didn't chase. I just stayed quietly, steadily, until her hesitation turned into trust. One evening, we found ourselves walking along the park trail at dusk. The air was cool, the sky washed in the last colors of sunset. Leaves whispered under our feet, and the world felt peaceful, almost suspended. She stopped by the bench overlooking the lake, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. "Do you ever wonder," she said softly, "if we're only here because life got tired of keeping us apart?" I smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe we just stopped resisting." She turned toward me, studying my face as if searching for proof that I meant it, that I wasn't chasing some fleeting idea of love. "You make it sound so simple," she whispered. "Because it is," I said gently. "You don't have to be anyone else with me. You don't have to explain." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, I saw all the emotions she tried to hide, the fear, the tenderness, the quiet hope. Then, without a word, she reached out and took my hand. Not urgently, not nervously, just softly, like she'd finally decided she didn't need to fight it anymore. We stood there for a while, our fingers interlaced, the world around us fading into evening. There was no need for declarations. What we had wasn't loud or dramatic. It was something gentler, a connection that had weathered its own doubts and found calm on the other side. As we walked back, I thought about that first day, her smile saying stop, her eyes saying try me. Now, when I look at her, I still see that same contradiction. But I understand it better. Her smile means caution, yes, but her eyes? They no longer dare me to try. They ask me to stay. And I do. Every time.